Please go to EliTheComputerGuy.com in order to view schematics, code, and more for the projects that you are learning about. Welcome back. So in today's video, I want to talk about MaaS, or Metal as a Service. So we've talked about software as a service, we've talked about platforms as a service, we've talked about infrastructure as a service. And so now I want to go into Metal as a Service. So what is Metal as a Service? Essentially, Metal as a Service is the concept of you being able to rent bare servers from some vendor or provider. So when we talk about software as a service, basically what you're doing is you're essentially renting the software from a provider that offers you access to that software in the cloud. So if you're using Salesforce, or if you're using Gmail, or you're using QuickBooks Online, any of that, essentially they've built the software. There is an interface for you, so you can actually go and use whatever that software is, and so you're able to access it that way. You're renting the software. If we talk about a platform as a service, basically the idea here is that you create the code, you create whatever code you want to create, whether it's a website or whether it's some kind of notification system, something like that. Basically, you need somewhere to put that code where it will actually run, and so you use some kind of platform as a service provider, or infrastructure as a service. And basically, with infrastructure as a service, that's where you look at things like DNS. DNS is the old school infrastructure as a service, but you think about DNS, you think about load balancing, you think about storage such as AWS Glacier or Azure Block Storage or Blob Storage, something like that. And that's infrastructure as a service. But Metal as a Service is basically the question about, well, here's the thing. I don't really want to buy a physical server, right? If you go out there and you buy a physical server, it's going to cost you a significant amount of money up front. And there's reasons that you may not want to do that. One, just do you have $4,000, $5,000, $10,000 to drop on a server? That's the first question. And then also there's things like tax liability. So when you purchase a $10,000 server, how that's dealt with from a tax perspective is different than where if you can just rent a server, right? So if you pay a monthly fee for a server, you can actually deduct that complete amount off of your taxes. But if you buy a server, there's some weird tax liability stuff that goes into that. So here's the question. It's like, well, I want more than simply the platform as a service, right? I want to be able to write my code, but I want to do a lot more with that code, right? I want to be able to manage the operating system itself. I want to be able to manage those low-level permissions. I may even want to be able to do things like be able to interact with the GPUs for artificial intelligence or machine learning, so my code can use the GPU to run faster. And so basically the idea with Metal as a Service is you simply go out and you rent a dedicated server that you're able to load an operating system on, and then more or less you have full control of that dedicated server. And so there's a lot of reasons that you may want to do this type of thing. Again, if you're going to be building your own clusters for some reason, if you're going to be, again, doing things like artificial intelligence or machine learning, if you just want raw performance, I've rented dedicated servers in the past. Oh, and from a pure performance play, it's amazing. For about the same price point that you would pay for a rather high-end virtual private server, you can get a dedicated server, and the performance you will get out of that dedicated server will just blow the virtual server just out of the water. So maybe there's something that you're doing that you want that extra performance out of. And so that's where Metal as a Service comes in. Now, again, with any of the vendors that you go out and deal with, what functionality, what features, what options they offer is completely up to them, right? So if you go out and you're going to rent a dedicated server, you're going to use Metal as a Service, and you're thinking about, well, that sounds good. What Eli's talking about sounds good. I want to be able to load my own operating system onto a dedicated server somewhere. So yeah, I'll just go with, GoDaddy or some provider that offers a dedicated server. One of the things that you do have to think about is that they many times will give you the options of the operating systems that you're allowed to install. So they might tell you specific versions of Ubuntu. They might tell you specific versions of CentOS. And so if you're coming out, let's say with FreeBSD, let's say you're like, oh, what I'm trying to run, we need FreeBSD, so I'm going to go with a dedicated server, this whole metal as a service idea, and I'll install FreeBSD onto one of these dedicated servers that I'm renting. Just realize that the company, the vendor that you're dealing with might not allow that. Essentially, this is basically what they do is it's essentially like an imaging type software. It's an imaging type process. And so they have images of different operating systems. They have different Windows operating systems, they have different Linux operating systems, they may have other types of things. Like some of the vendors actually have the VMware hypervisors. So you can just install a VMware hypervisor onto the dedicated server so that you can then spin up instances on that VMware hypervisor. But here's the thing. You are able to install what they allow you to install. So again, if you come in with your FreeBSD, if they don't allow the option for FreeBSD, you might run into problems that way. So all we're talking about is metal as a service is essentially you're able to rent dedicated servers from these service providers. Sometimes you can rent them hourly, sometimes you can rent them monthly, sometimes you have to do multi-year contracts. Again, that gets into the business realm, but the basic concept here is you're renting these dedicated servers from these vendors. That way you don't have to buy the server yourself. You don't have to worry about the data center itself. You don't have to worry about a lot of things. You can simply spin up a server, get all the access to those bare metal resources that can be very, very fast. And you can actually do that. So with that, let's go over to the computer so I can show you some of the options you have out there with metal as a service, because this is one of those things I think a lot more companies really need to think about. Again, when we start thinking about the cloud, again, you get a lot of people out there like, oh, I don't trust Google for whatever reason. Or I don't trust AWS. Well, again, when we start talking about the cloud is just a concept. It's just a way of thinking about your infrastructure. So you can have a dedicated server where you have root level access to that server. You configure everything for that server to do everything that it needs. It's simply sitting in somebody else's data center. So again, you don't have to worry about all the stuff that goes into you actually having to build your own data center out. So let's go over to the computer and I can show you some of the options that some of the service providers will offer you. So here we are at the good old standard GoDaddy. So again, GoDaddy.com is not who I would use if I'm trying to build some kind of large scale infrastructure. But if all I'm trying to do is, let's say, spin up a website that I think is going to get hammered by a lot of users, simply buying one or two dedicated servers from someplace like GoDaddy may be all that you need. Again, to be clear, if you're going to be spinning up a dozen servers, if you're going to have a complicated infrastructure, GoDaddy is not who I would go for. But if you're some, mid-sized company, you've got some kind of web app that your people are going to be interacting with you through, you want some better performance, simply going with something like a GoDaddy server may be the way to go for you. So again, you get dedicated server hosting. If we go down here, we can see the different options. And again, the prices really are not that bad. So if you go for the economy option, it starts at $89 a month. Again, whenever you're dealing with these cloud service providers, make sure you know the difference between the initial cost and the ongoing cost, because this really is tedious. This is one of the things that I really hate. I don't want to beat up on GoDaddy too much for it because a lot of companies do it, but it is idiotically obnoxious. So it starts at $90, and then when you renew, it goes up to $170, right? So for your business or organization or even your own pocket, that can be a hell of a hit. So do make sure you know not only what the initial price is going to be, but what the follow-on price is going to be. Again, the value starts at $104, jumps up to $200. Deluxe goes from $130 to $250. Ultimate goes from $180 to $349. So be very careful. Whenever you're budgeting things for like cloud purchases, always budget based off of what the renewal price will be, not off of what the initial price will be. Because again, like if you're spinning up multiple servers, again, like let's say with GoDaddy, you're going to spin up, let's say 3 servers. So 3 servers at $180 a piece, that comes out to $540 per month. So $540 per month for a mid-sized company or even a small company in order to give yourself some high performance infrastructure, that may make a lot of sense. But if it goes from 540 and then it goes all the way up to 10,000, or no, I'm sorry, it goes up to 1,050. right? The difference between 540 and 1,050 per month is very significant. So do be careful with the prices. But we can come down here, we can take a look at what they offer. So 4 CPU cores at 3.1 gigahertz, you get 4 gigs of RAM, you get 1 terabyte of storage, unmetered bandwidth. So again, this is one thing that you're gonna have to think about, depending on what services you're gonna be offering, what you're gonna be using the server for, is what is the bandwidth like. So some bandwidth is unlimited, other bandwidth you get 1 terabyte, some places you get 20 terabytes. You know, if all you're doing is a database, if all you're doing is a website, then 1 terabyte max isn't gonna matter. Again, for something like eli@computerguy.com or failnormal.com, if I had 1 terabyte of bandwidth per month, that would be fine for the website itself, because all of the video streaming actually comes from the Vimeo platform. But on the other hand, if I was gonna be hosting all of those videos myself on my own infrastructure, then I would probably want, 20 or 30 terabytes of bandwidth. So that's something you're gonna have to think about. IP addresses, how many IP addresses you get. This may be valuable for you or not. And again, you can see for $90, this is what you get. For $104 starting, four CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM, 1.5 terabytes. You go up to the 130, that gives you 16 gigs of RAM, 2 terabytes, and you go up to the 180, that gets you 32 gigs of RAM and 2 terabytes. And this is one of the things where you're going to have to actually start to be a real tech professional and figure out what resources you actually need, right? I know a lot of geeks out there, they always like to go for the most RAM possible. They always like to go for the most resources possible. Well, if I can buy 32 gigs of RAM, I'm gonna buy 32 gigs of RAM. Again, if all you're doing is running a WordPress site, if basically you're just running a WordPress site that's gonna get a few thousand visitors per day, I would go for 4, maybe 8, just to be on the safe side. I might go with like 8 gigs of RAM. There is no way in hell you need 32 gigs of RAM. On the other hand, if you're going to be doing encoding processes, so you're going to put, let's say, FFmpeg on this particular server, and you're going to do video encoding, then you do need to start figuring out how much RAM you actually need. So these are some things to think about. Then we go down, we can see the host server. So again, one thing to be thinking about when it says CPU cores at 3.1 gigahertz, one of the problems you get to in the cloud world is what the hell does any of this actually mean? Like, that doesn't mean a whole bunch. So for you, depending on what you're going to be using, what you're going to be running, you want to look to see what the actual servers are. So here they say processor type, you get one of the Xeon E3-1220-V3. And so basically what you can do is, depending on what software you're going to be running on your particular dedicated server, you can see if this will be good enough for you. Generally, again, to be clear, by and large, something like one of these Xeon servers should be fine, but you never know. So just verify before you take out a year or 2 contract. Processor memory, again, tells you 32 gig. ECC, it tells you it's a DDR3, gives you that information. Processor cache, so on and so forth. So these are some of the things you need to think about. Then you can go down and you can look at the other things that they give you with a dedicated server. Things like a cPanel, right? So if you're going to be needing a control panel in order to configure your server, right? So if all you want is SSH into your server, let's say you're going to be running Linux, so you just have SSH, you're going to be running your own stuff, then you may not need cPanel. On the other hand, again, if you're going to be running websites, if you're going to be running other things, if you're going to have other users, let's say administrators having to deal with your dedicated server, you may want something like a control panel. So something to think about. It gives you some other kinds of information, that kind of stuff. Then we can come down here. You can see the different levels of management. So self-managed, managed, and fully managed. So this can be valuable for you if you don't have a lot of tech support within your company. Let's say you're one geek in your company, or you only have a couple of people, and so you're worried about, what happens if my server crashes, right? So I rent a dedicated server, but what if there's a problem with that dedicated server that's beyond my knowledge? Well, one of the things you can do is you can actually get a fully managed server. So what a fully managed server does, it allows you to do a lot of the configurations, but then if there needs to be any kind of troubleshooting, they have technicians on staff that can troubleshoot your server for you. So this is where we talk about things like maintenance contracts or service contracts. Basically, that's what we're talking about here in the cloud world, is with this managed or these fully managed options. Basically, think of these as service contracts. The problem you run into, though, is, again, anytime you get something, you lose something, right? So if you look at the self-managed, what you can see here is as far as operating systems are concerned, you get CentOS 6 or 7 you can install. You can do Fedora 20 and 22, or you can do Ubuntu, right? So if you do self-managed, you're the one responsible for the server. You get these options of operating systems that you can install. If you do managed or fully managed, you get CentOS 6. That's all you get. So again, it's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. That's just how it is. If you want to be completely responsible for your servers, you get all these options. If you want help with your servers from the company, you're locked into this particular operating system. They have monitoring services they offer, proactive network and host. Again, this can be nice to give you alerts if there's any kind of problem. Again, if you self-manage, they give you some monitoring. If it's managed or fully managed, it actually gives you some different monitoring options. Patching, so basically if it's managed or fully managed, they do the patching for you. If it's self-managed, you've got to do the patching for yourself. Root access, and so this is something that's important. So again, that root access, actually being able to have access to your server at the absolute root level. Under self-managed, you get that. Under managed and fully managed, you don't. Control panels, backups, migrations, dedicated IPs. So you get 1 dedicated IP with self-managed. You get 3 with the managed and the fully managed. And again, this is the things that kind of get a little weird. Like, why do you only get 1 IP for self-managed and you get 3 IPs if it's fully managed? That just seems a little bit weird. But these are the things to think about, and depending on what you're looking for, this might be a solution for you. Then we can go over to, let's say, IBM. So IBM, again, has a lot of really good enterprise class solutions, right? So if you're on the Microsoft stack, I tell people you probably should take a look at Azure. If you are building if you're building out cloud infrastructure for like the next Facebook or the next Snapchat or whatever, AWS is probably your option. But if you're doing some more of this enterprise stuff, if you're doing some more of the scientific type stuff, again, the really heavy hitting type of computer technology, you might really want to take a look at IBM Cloud. They have a lot of interesting things out there. And so one of the things that they offer is GPUs for cloud servers. So this is where we talk about with like artificial intelligence, or a lot of the software nowadays is literally being written to run on GPUs because graphic processing units are faster in a lot of things than the CPUs. And so if you have software that needs to run on a GPU, then you actually want to rent a dedicated server with a GPU. So they have these options here. It talks about what a GPU is. If we scroll down, we can see that they have bare metal server GPU options. And so here they tell you what you can actually get. So NVIDIA Tesla 32 gig V100 gives you all of this information right here. And basically you figure out, is this something that you need, right? So if you're trying to run your software on a GPU, this may be the place to go. Then it shows you the different options. Again, you're going to be dealing with real prices here. You're going to deal with real prices here. The low end is $519, the middle is $634, and the high end is $754. So again, this is actually a real expense, but again, you go up to $754 per month, and you get a 36-core processor, you get 32 gigs of RAM, you get a 1 you get 1 terabyte SATA drive, and then you get 20 terabytes of bandwidth. And so as I was talking about before, when we looked at GoDaddy, you got unlimited bandwidth. So here you get 20 terabytes of bandwidth. So that should be more than enough for most people. But again, depending on your particular situation, it might not be. Then you can click on the Order Now button. Once you click on the Order Now button, and then it gives you a lot of options. How many of these things do you want to order? I'm going to order a lot of them, right? I'm going to get 2 or 3 or 4. Billing. So you do want to do hourly billing, monthly. For this, they don't allow the 1 or 3 year contracts. Locations. Again, we've talked about this before for things like latency, having your servers as close to the end users as possible. So you can see here they default to Dallas, but they have San Jose, they have Sao Paulo, they have Frankfurt, they have Tokyo, they have Washington. So you would come in here and you would pick where you want this server to be in what data center. And again, if you want fault tolerance, if you want things like synchronization and replication, you could have one server be in Dallas, and you could have another server be in Tokyo, and you could have another server be in San Jose. So those are things to think about. Then you come down here, and it's almost like speccing out a server off of Dell, right? They give you all of these different options: Intel Xeon 4110, 16 cores, 2.1 gigahertz, 96 gigs of RAM. Gives you features over here. So basically, like if you need a GPU, then you want to select an option that has a GPU. UEFI boot, if that's something that matters to you. GPU with UEFI boot, if that matters to you. Basically, you can go through here, select whatever processor you want, and then down here you can take a look at the GPUs. So they do offer some different GPUs here. So NVIDIA Tesla K80 for an extra $500 a month. NVIDIA Tesla P100 graphics card for an additional $650 a month, or NVIDIA Tesla 16 gig V100 for $900 a month. So you get those options, right? Then you can come down, you can select how much RAM. So again, if you really got some money, you get 1.5 terabytes of RAM for a mere $2,800 extra per month. You know, if you just put that in there, you're only spending $3,300 a month. Then here, again, this is where I talk about with the operating system. So they have CentOS, they have Citrix, they have Debian, OS Nexus, Microsoft, FreeBSD, Red Hat, Ubuntu. Again, VMware options here. So you can take a look, and they've got the different versions, Virtuoso. Or for them, they do have a no operating system option. I'm curious to see how that works. I haven't actually used IBM before, so I'm not sure how the no OS works. And so this is the type of thing, is don't assume. Call them or contact them and figure out, like, if you have your own image of an operating system, make sure you understand how you can install it onto their dedicated servers, if that's what you decide to go with. Then there's additional add-ons. If you click on this, again, OS add-ons, control panel software, again, cPanel or Plesk, if that's your thing, database software, all kinds of different services here. Storage disks, so 1 of 12 disks. So you can add, multiple disks. You can say what kind of media it is. You can say what the size should be. Basically put that into whatever you want. They have additional add-ons here for file storage, different things like that. Interface, do you want it to be public and private, or just private? So again, this is something to be thinking about when you're building out infrastructure. If you have servers that all they're going to do is communicate to each other, then you don't want them to be public facing, right? Again, like if let's say I have an encoding server. So the encoding server takes files so I upload video files to an FTP server. The encoding server then takes the files from the FTP server and then basically outputs them to a different server. So think about it, that encoding server, there is no reason there should be public access over the network to that encoding server. All that encoding server does is take from the FTP server and dump it somewhere else. And so this is one of the things you can do with security, is since nobody needs to access it from the outside world, then for the network, you simply set it to a private interface, and then that makes it more secure. They have things like port redundancy here, and then things like port speed. So again, you get 100 megabits per second. That's no additional cost. 1 gig per second is $20 a month. Or again, for something like this, you can go up to 10 gigs per second for $200 a month. And then this is where they talk about the bandwidth. And so with this, you get 20 terabytes. You can select that with different things, and there's different other add-ons here. So basically, this is one of the options that's available out there for you, and that's with IBM Cloud. Past that, we can take a look at this particular company. So this particular company is Leader GPU. Again, when you're going for cloud providers nowadays, a lot of these providers spin up. How long they last, I don't know, but while they're around, they may offer you a solution that you're interested in. And so with these people, all they do is dedicated GPU servers. And so depending on what kind of GPU you need, as you scroll down, you can see you can get servers for GeForce GTX 1080s. And they give you information here, GTX 1080 Ti, RTX 2080 Ti, Tesla T4, NVIDIA Tesla P100, RTX, projects, blah, blah. They've got lots and lots of options here. And so this is what you need to think about. And this is why it's important to understand what your software or what your services require. Again, in the real world of IT, most of what IT professionals do, in all seriousness, is we just frickin' paint by numbers. When people ask me, like, oh, what GPU do you have? Or what graphics card are you going to buy? You know how I decide what graphics card I'm going to buy? I look at the software that I use. I look at the system requirements for that software, and then I give myself some padding. I add about 25% to whatever the hell that says, and then that's the graphics card I buy. That's realistically how it goes in the real world of IT. You don't want to over-purchase, right? You don't want to spend money on resources you're not going to use, because that's literally wasted money. And you don't want to under-provision. You don't want to buy fewer resources than you need, because then your infrastructure is just going to suck ass. So what you need to do is you need to figure out what does your infrastructure actually need, and then purchase based off of that. And so again, depending on what you're doing, you may go, oh, thank God, I really need it. My stuff really needs to work on an NVIDIA Tesla V100. And so if that's the case, you'll come here and you'll order it now. So this is one of the options out there. And then again, you can go over, again, there's a lot of dedicated server options available. And here, if you're looking for like a lower price, again, GoDaddy was kind of high with that $90. And then after the renewal, it goes up significantly. This is a company here, ghost. And if you take a look, instant server setup, super micro blade, you get 16 gigs of RAM, you get 1 terabyte of storage, you get 200 megabits per second unmetered. You get all of this for only $50 per month. So again, that might be a better thing for you. And then again, like I said, you can come here, you can select what you want, you can select what currency, you can select what region you want your server to be in, the different server types, different processor types. If I click on this, I can go over and I can click buy. Oops. Let's see here. Let me refresh. And of course, I can click buy and it fails. There we go. So I can click buy, and then again, you come in here to different options. OS without panel, OS with panel, without OS. Then look, this gives you a lot of different options. So CentOS 7, Debian 9, 10, VMware. Those are things to look at. Bandwidth. So what bandwidth do you want? You get 200 megabits per second. You can go up to 1 gigabit per second, but that'll cost you $200 a month. Again, and that's where you have to look at price points. Well, the server is really inexpensive, but if you need that gig per second speed for some reason, it's an extra $200 a month. Like, look at it, like 200 megabits per second. You're like, oh, that's not too bad, and that comes for free. Yeah, it won't be any big deal. If I need to upgrade, no big deal. But if you need to upgrade for some reason to 1 gig, it's an extra $200 just for that 1 gig connection. So that can be a bit brutal. Billing term, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, different days. And so again, this is something you need to be thinking about with your infrastructure is how long do you want that contract to be, so on and so forth. And so those are some of the options you have when you're looking to go out there and purchase dedicated servers and when you're dealing with Metal as a Service. Now, if you're a real geek, you're sitting there going, well, that's nice and all. That's nice and all to be renting Metal as a Service. But Eli, what I want to know is how do I set up my own Metal as a Service? And to be clear, in general, I would recommend that you don't. But what's kind of cool is there is actually a Metal as a Service component to Ubuntu. If you're interested and you got a couple of physical servers laying around, you can actually build your own Metal as a Service infrastructure. So let's go over to the computer for a second. Just to kind of show you this, I don't recommend you do this. Again, if you're going to do Metal as a Service, buy it from somebody else. But if you just want to play around with this idea, I do think this is kind of cool. So here we are at the MaaS.io website. This is a canonical website, so basically the creators of Ubuntu, and basically this is welcome to Metal as a Service. So if you're a die-hard geek, you got a couple of, well, more than a couple, I don't know, you got a couple of dozen physical servers laying around. Maybe you want to try to play around and build your own metal as a service. So basically, this is pretty cool if you go through and you take a look at the information. Essentially, you install the software onto a management server. That management server is then able to look and find all of the other servers that are on the network, and through configurations and all of that, you can actually create your own metal as a service infrastructure. So automatic discovery of every network device, BMC ops with IPMI, AMT, and other protocols, PXE over IPv4 and IPv6 networks, APIs for DNS, DHCP, IPAM server configuration and provisioning. And basically with this software, what you're able to do is you're actually able to create that metal as a service environment. And the cool thing here is you're not logged into simply installing Linux onto these machines. So the same thing is you have the ISO, or basically you have the operating system files, and you're able to say, okay, I want to deploy a Windows server to that physical box, and I want to deploy a Linux server to that physical box. And you actually get all of that kind of management, and you're able to do that within your own cloud infrastructure. So if you haven't taken a look at MaaS IO, again, unless you have a lot of time and a lot of physical boxes, I would not recommend going down this rabbit hole to hell, but it is kind of cool to take a look at and at least know that this exists. So that's an overview of metal as a service. Essentially what you're doing is you're going out there and you're renting dedicated servers. Now I know what you're probably thinking right now. You're probably thinking, well, wait a minute. Those price points, more or less, depending on the vendor, they're really not too bad. And if Eli's saying the performance you get out of being able to interact with the bare metal is so much better, and it really is so much better than even the high-end virtual private servers out there, then why in the world would I rent a VPS? Why wouldn't I just do the dedicated server? Well, here's the thing. Here's the crux of the problem. Here's the crux of the situation. Since you're renting a complete dedicated box, you're renting a dedicated server, just realize, simply because you can't see the dedicated server, simply because you don't really know where in the cloud the dedicated server is, doesn't mean that the CPU fan disappears. Here's the thing. Whenever you're dealing with physical boxes, those physical boxes are single points of failure. So unless you configure those dedicated servers into some kind of fault-tolerant cluster, basically you still have one single point of failure. So if the CPU fan fails in that dedicated server, your dedicated server is going to go down. Hopefully your data isn't going to be corrupted when it goes down. And whenever the geeks over in the data center get around to fixing that CPU fan, hopefully your server will be back up and running. So that's one of the issues with these dedicated servers, is you can have real normal physical failures. I actually ran into this in the real world, and I was less than amused. From the support that I got from the provider I was purchasing the dedicated server from. Basically, it was one of those things. I had a Linux box. It had literally been up for a year. And so I did some updates. I was thinking, I haven't rebooted this box in a year because it's a Linux machine. I did the updates. I did some configuration changes. Why don't I just reboot the system now, just so it'll be up and running for another year and I won't have to worry about it? The problem is basically there was supposed to be disk mirroring. So both hard drives were supposed to be mirrors of each other. But there was some kind of failure in one of the drives, which shouldn't have been a big deal because it's mirrored. It's mirrored, right? So basically the idea with mirroring is, okay, if one drive fails, then the geeks pull that drive out, shove the new drive in, it rebuilds the RAID, and you're back and operating in about an hour or so. And the company that I dealt with, they literally sold based off of that drive mirroring. When I rebooted the dedicated server, there was a failure on one of the hard drives. Because there was a failure on one of the hard drives, the operating system refused to boot. Right? And so when I started talking to support, they said, okay, well, we'll put in a new hard drive for you, and then you can just restore from backup. Which, to be clear, I was a good geek. I had my backups. I didn't lose any data because of this process. But it was really one of those eye-opening experiences where I'm sitting there going, well, wait a minute, no, I'm I'm renting a dedicated server from you with disk mirroring so that I have fault tolerance, so that if one drive fails, you can just pop another one in and I can go about my business and I don't have to do a frickin' data recovery. I don't have to go through the whole recovery process. But how they built that system, even though somehow it was mirrored, if one drive failed, everything just kind of cracked out. And so that's something that you really do have to think about with these dedicated servers. And again, that's the whole, again, better price to performance, really dedicated servers is awesome. You get a lot of benefits from a maintenance standpoint. Again, you don't have to worry about the power supply, the power coming into the building. You don't have to worry about your own data center. You don't have to worry about a lot of things with the dedicated servers. On the other hand, again, it's one server. It's one single point of failure. If the CPU fan fails, if a hard drive fails, if something else fails on that server, that basically means that server has now dropped and it's no longer useful to you until somebody else. And that's the thing, on somebody else's time that they repair it, and that they repair it to anything that you would consider a high standard. You don't know what it was like. I was about having a meltdown on that phone. I was about having a meltdown on the phone. It's like, no, but this is what you sell. But you sell based off of redundancy. They're like, well, don't you have a backup? I'm like, yeah, but that's literally not the point. I mean, literally the point is you're supposed to pop in a hard drive and half an hour to an hour, the RAID should rebuild itself and I should go about my business. Like one of the big reasons I went with you is so I wouldn't have to recover from backups. So that's one of the things with Metal as a Service and dedicated. And that's where you gotta weigh everything out and really think about it. So as always, I enjoyed doing this video and look forward to seeing you in the next one.